What was that?
Okay.
Let me turn back on my video and audio. What was that like for you to watch that, Ed?
I haven't watched that in years. Oh my goodness, how I was offended.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Oh, just some of the stuff there, Elohim coming down to have sex with Mary. The blacks being turned black, the black race being turned black, and just some of the stuff that's in there. But you know what? Every single word of it, as I was listening and watching, I could document every single bit of it. I mean, it's
So
gospel.
the one part that jumped out at me was the part about Mary Magdalene and a couple other specific wives.
Yeah.
I don't think, I know that Bruce R. McConkie taught that that Joseph Smith was a direct descendant of Jesus, a blood descendant of Jesus, and that Jesus had multiple wives, and that's why Joseph had to be a polygamist, because he had to restore all things, and that since Jesus had multiple wives, and he named some of the women in the Bible as Jesus's multiple wives, that's why Joseph had to be a polygamist too, and so forth. But that's one part that jumped out at me. I don't remember learning that in mainstream Mormonism.
No, no, that's not mainstream Mormonism, but it's part of that whole creation of the theological belly of Mormonism, or backbone of Mormonism that carries through the entirety of Mormonism. You have to understand those things. The names of the women are immaterial, actually. I know that we got them right from probably Journal of Discourse or somewhere, but the point of it is that the names of the women is
doesn't matter. Yeah. I'm going to read a comment that my friend from the UK, Stephen Bloomfield, writes. He says, what Ed compiles in a few minutes took Mormons years and years to discover and self-assemble through implicit teachings and doctrine fed through many books and teachings of previous church leaders, not to mention having to attend the temple, which was not discussed. So basically, I'm going to just say why I think that was a really important contribution. Anyone who was raised in Mormonism in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and early 80s has to admit that 90 to 95% of what's in that video, we all were taught, right?
Yeah. All right.
We were all taught that. And I'm 50 years old. I went to seminary in the 1980s. I was taught all that. I was taught about the war in heaven. I was taught about Lucifer. I was taught about Lucifer and Jesus being brothers. I was taught about, God and Jesus being separate gods, and that polygamy was the law, and that, we could become gods someday, and that blacks were cursed because of their dark skin. Like, all of that's true. You talked about Joseph Smith and being a treasure seeker. I wasn't taught that, but that ended up being true. And you talked about, the purpose of life being going, celestial kingdom with multiple wives and having lots of babies. Like, all of that's true. What was super disturbing about that video is no one had ever put it together in one brief form and then shared it with the world. And it was just incredibly embarrassing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I was talking to an older missionary to the Mormons, John L. Smith. He used to be a pastor in Utah for many years, and he had a ministry to the Mormons. And we got talking about our differences. He said, my difference is in Utah for 17 years as a pastor. He said, to be a life example, to live my life so that I was an example. He said, you were different. You went out and started setting fire to all the fields. And he said, I've never led a Mormon to the Lord. In those 17 years of being an example, you went out and confronted them face to face with their doctrines of what I call doctrines of demons, which is another article on my website that deals with it.
Right. Well, and even now, some guy named Tim Rathbone is saying, no, we were not taught all of that. So I don't know what church, Tim, you were raised in, but I was taught all that. And I'm not making that up. I would have told you that 20 years ago when I was still a Mormon. Tim, I want you to list, Tim Rathbone, I want you to list right now which parts of that video you were not taught. because I'm dying to see. And let's just say that you weren't taught a few things, Tim. I want to know what substantive parts of that video you weren't taught, because for me, even if you could nitpick 5%, what substantively about that video isn't accurate? It's accurate. And I just think that's spin when somebody claims that those things aren't true. It's just uncomfortable. It's awkward to hear what we say about Native Americans and their dark skin, and them being racist. It's uncomfortable to hear about the racist folklore about blacks being less valiant in the pre-existence. I was taught that by Lawrence Layton in my seminary class in Katy, Texas, in the 1980s. So, here Jamie Menendez is saying I was taught all that. Tim Rathbone says some of it comes from the Journal of Discourses. Even that Journal of Discourses was taught all throughout our childhood and early adulthood as the words of the prophets. So
Yeah.
now because of Ed Decker and the Tanners and other people, the church distances itself.
And prophets liars. Then he's if it's not true because it comes from the mouth of an earlier prophet or an apostle at a general conference, which is what a lot of the journal discourses are, then that means that they are liars and deceivers.
Yeah, and I'm getting a lot of people now who are responding. Jamie writes, I was taught all that. Carla Joe writes, I was taught 90% of that all. Eden writes, yes, we were taught all of that. Ken says, I was taught all of that. I went to seminary at the same time as you, John DeLynn. Daniel writes, Tim might be very young. A lot of that stuff is not taught anymore. And that's the whole freaking point of why I'm having Ed Decker on. Yes, a lot of this stuff isn't taught anymore, but that's because of Ed Decker and his work. And the Tanners and other people had the courage and the foresight to promote it through books, through the movies. And it became so embarrassing to the church that starting in the 80s, and then certainly in the 90s and afterwards, the church starts distancing itself from the Journal of Discourses, distancing itself from some of Joseph Smith's doctrine, changing the Mormon temple ceremony dramatically by 1990, and rewriting its own history. I remember
just denying, just in the last few weeks, that the Lamanites were given dark skins because of their loathsomeness and their evil, when they put it into the new Sunday school manuals, and some child in Salt Lake started crying to her mother that this is not true, that that the Indians, maybe she was an Indian, that they're cursed with a dark skin. The church pulled back all the manuals and denied it.
Yeah. And if you read the gospel topics essays now that the church has put out, it's this huge. The last 10 years has been this huge effort to gaslight Mormons, to sort of say, well, that was never doctrine. We never taught that. That was just folklore. That was just policy. And so what we now see in the last 10 to 15 years, it basically took 10 or 20 years for the church to start moving. But Ed, we have you along with the Tanners and Leonard Arrington and D. Michael Quinn and a lot of other pioneers. We have you guys to thank for the church making these incredible shifts over the past 10 or 15 years that I would argue improves Mormonism. But it starts with the book and the movie that you are releasing in the early 80s, basically putting a mirror up to the church saying, this is what you're teaching, this is what you believe, this is what you're telling people. I'm going to tell the whole world what you really do think and feel and believe. And of course, the church didn't like how it sounded. The church didn't like what it looked like and how it appeared to others. It's bad PR.
And they didn't know how to handle it.
They didn't know how to handle it.
They sent one of their leading apologists to debate me on television in Chicago.
Who is that?
The Mormon Church.
No, what apologist?
I can't remember his name now.
Oh, okay.
But they had two of these people. One was a very gruff attorney, and he was chosen to like take me on, and then this very smooth stake president type guy, a semi-general authority type, he took on Dave Hunt, and Dave Hunt was a mild guy, and I'm not a mild person. And so they had us done this way, and we got on this national or this regional television program. The host was a guy named Rose. I can't think of his first name. I think it was Charlie Rose, but I can't bet on it. And so it was on regular television all over the Chicago area. And in it, I brought up the fact that Lucifer and Jesus were brothers, and it was the tough guy started yelling at me and screaming at me, and the host made him quiet down, and he turned to the nice guy, the suave, sophisticated, slow speaking, sweet honey coming off his lips, and he said, "What do you have to say about that?" And he said, "Yes, it's true."
Yeah, well, let's be clear.
Let me just say the rest of it. He said, "Yes, it is true. Do you know what? I am Satan's brother too." And I mean, that was the end of the debate. They cut it short and got out of there. It was the most revealing thing that you could have ever seen. And never again did they do a debate.
So that point's a little bit interesting because, yeah, the doctrine of preexistence, we're all brothers and sisters. So, I mean, to say that Satan and Jesus were brothers is slightly deceptive in the sense that it makes it sound like they were raised in some nuclear family, it's like older and younger brother. The theology is that we were all spiritual offspring of God.
Except that the scripture, the Mormon doctrine says that Elohim brought his two eldest sons.
Right. So they were the two oldest. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, and I'll just keep reading through because this is really important, everybody. In what I really was struck by when I watched the Godmakers, 10 years ago, as someone who no longer believed the Mormon Church was true, and as someone who was dedicating their lives to helping prevent divorce, helping prevent suicide. By the time I watched the Godmakers, I'm aware of all the LGBT suicides going on of gay and lesbian Mormons. I'm aware of mixed faith marriages ending divorce, of how the church is wrecking families. And in the Godmakers, you address that. In the movie, you talk about people committing suicide because they lose their faith and get rejected by their family. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about what made you want to include that in the movie?
Because it was very important. It's not just about the doctrine; it's about the people that are being damaged and hurt, and need someone. That's what's happening in Utah today. There are so many young couples who are reaching out to their neighbors who are leaving the church. They can bring the gospel and the peace of Christ to these people. The days of the Tanners and the Deckers and all of us, are kind of old. What's happening today is more in a different sophistication.
But wait, I don't want to miss the point. So going back to why you included that in the film, what happened in your life? Who did you experience? Who did you meet? Where you became sympathetic to people getting divorced or even committing suicide over a faith crisis?
Well, as I traveled and spoke, particularly in Utah, and California was another area, people would come up after the meeting and talk to me and tell me what they're going through and how their son committed suicide, or how this happened or how that happened, and how when he found the Lord, his wife, he went home one day and the house was empty and his wife and kids were gone, moved away by the local Mormons to another place, and I helped them get attorneys to go and find these kids and these people, and I saw that whole system of manipulation of families and people, and the broken hearts, the brokenness, and the people who were willing to sit there on camera and tell us about it. Those are real people, actual real people on that film who exposed that. There's a guy there whose son was gay, and the son committed suicide. and he talked about it. I don't have much truck with the doctrines of other types of lifestyles, and I'm not a gay person. I've got a couple of gay cousins. I've got some gay friends. I love them. I don't like the lifestyle, but I don't know more people who have gone, particularly in the Mormon Church, who have gone through more misery even today, when their kids aren't allowed to be baptized in the church, and they're shunned, and they still, these people, one of the websites and one of the forum groups is Exponent too, and they tell you, you hear the stories of the horror stories that go through
of gay and lesbian Mormons.
Gay and lesbian Mormons that are going through, and I have tremendous empathy for them. I don't, like I said, I don't like I love my cousins. I love them in pieces. They come to my home. There's no differentiation between how I treat them and how I treat anybody else. It's just that I wish they didn't have the lifestyle, but that's their choice. I'm not going to get into it. God never called me.
But you were sympathetic to the fact that these gay and lesbian Mormons were committing suicide. Well, Mormon Stories, we're definitely supportive of LGBT people, so I want to be clear. But I just want to, I think that's you're 30, 40 years ahead of so many of us by at least having compassion and concern for LGBT Mormons that were committing suicide. So that's a huge deal. You talk about, again, divorce and mixed faith marriages. That's a huge deal. You talk about how the Mormon scriptures changed and evolved over time. That's a huge deal. You talk about Book of Mormon archaeology, and how the church, there's no credible evidence for the Book of Mormon archaeology. And again, this was back when the church was putting out film strips like Ancient America Speaks. We're trying to prove that the Book of Mormon was true with false archaeology. And you were saying back in the early 80s that the Book of Mormon had no archaeological foundation and was not credible. You were saying the same thing about the Book of Abraham and the papyrus and the fragments and all that. You were talking about that in the God Makers. Again, you were talking about the temple rituals, the temple garment, which was obviously really embarrassing. You talked about Joseph Smith's background with the occult, which was all true. This is pre-Michael Quinn when you're talking about that. You talked about the economic power of the Mormon Church, something that we're still just now starting to get a really full picture of. The church is now worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
That they've hidden.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, so many instances, you were a pioneer in not only recognizing all these problems, because I'm sure the Tanners, were concerned about all these things. Obviously, the Leonard Arrington administration, some of the historians that he hired, those things were being investigated. There was this bubbling emergence of authentic Mormon history that was starting to deal with these issues, but you figured them all out way before most of us. But not only that, you were so effective at getting them out, writing a book that was successful and getting a successful movie, and you're like mortgaging your own house to do this. Like, for anyone who criticizes me for interviewing Ed Decker, you just have to acknowledge how right the God Makers was, and how right Ed Decker was 40 to 50 years before Jeremy Runnels, before John DeLynn, before Mormon Stories, before Mormon Think, even before Sunstone, and Dialogue was really dealing with most of these issues. So
what I wanted to tell you about the God Makers movie was that as soon as it was put in the can, we sent a certified letter to every one of the general authorities and rented a theater near Temple Square, within a block or two of it, as I remember. And we invited every leader of the Mormon Church and the general authorities and the bishopric and all that whole general authority crowd. We invited them and their representatives to come to the movie and see it before it was released to the public. And if they had any criticism of error, that we would sit with them and go through it and correct and be open to not releasing the film until that was taken care of. And no general authority showed up, but a lot of attorneys showed up. And so we showed the film to maybe a third of the people that we wanted to be there, but pretty much someone told me they're pretty much attorneys for the church that came. And we got not one single response, not one criticism, not one correction, but we brought it to them before we ever released it to the public. And we did that to several of our films.
Yeah. So what was the response to the movie? So the movie goes out. You didn't release it. You didn't do like a cinematic release, right? Where you're releasing it.
No. That was before the multi-theaters, okay? We're talking about the old school. So we advertised, and we had Saints Alive chapters all around the country. And we also had the film done in several different languages. And then, like in Spanish, and then for 2 years, we were averaging, because we went up to 500 reels. We were averaging 1,000 churches per week filled to the walls for people to see it, and somebody would be there to answer questions. And then it kind of waned, then we went into the DVDs, and then we produced about 250,000 DVDs. We mailed out probably 40,000 in Utah. All just randomly took mailing lists and sent them out in Utah. And then it went to the VHS is what it was. And then we went to the DVD, the little discs now. And so we have given out probably a couple of 100,000 copies of the Godmaker movie on either disc or on VHS.
And so what was it like in the United States and in your ministry once this movie really starts taking hold?
We were overwhelmed.
In what way?
Letters, particularly phone calls. I would go to Boise, Idaho, and I would speak, and then I'd be there 3 days just meeting with people.
So when you would go and show your movie and speak, is that right?
Yeah.
And what types of audiences would be at these? Would these be Baptist church, evangelical churches?
All of them.
What were the main types of churches that would show your movie?
Baptist, evangelical, non-denominational, Assemblies of God, Lutheran, Presbyterian.
And at the peak of this movie, how many people would be sitting in a church watching this movie?
As big as a church can handle. If a church could only seat 500 people, there'd be 580. We would show it like in Colorado Springs. There was a big Presbyterian church there, and we had to do 3 showings because there were cars parked 2 miles down the road trying to get in. And so what happened, we'd show the movie, and then I would go to a separate educational building, and then I would answer questions. And then the people that were, I'd talk to people first while the movie's on. And then the movie would be over. These people would come in to get questions answered, and these people would go in and see the movie. And so we were many times in some of the bigger churches having 1,500 to 2,000 people watching the movie. And I want to
how often did Mormons actually show up?
Many times.
And what was that like? What was your interaction with Mormons when they'd come see the movie?
Well, they would get very upset, and they would ask me questions and challenge me, and I'd have the answer. And
how would they challenge? What would they say when they tried to challenge you?
They said, "Say, you say that Joseph, I can't even remember all the things they say. Oh, your representation of the temple ritual is wrong. I've never I never did those oaths. And I said, are you standing here before the Mormon God in the world and saying that you never put your thumb to your throat and swore to have your throat slit if you revealed it? And most of the time they would get up and run out. I showed the Temple of the God Makers movie at University of Utah in the main auditorium there, filled it up to the walls with students, mostly Mormon students. And so there was, I love that kind of environment, because you want to bless the person asking the question, and you kind of got to pat them in the back and kick them in the fanny at the same time with the truth. And so it was really going well. And then one guy stood up and he said, Mr. Decker, is it true that you were excommunicated for adultery? And the whole 1,000, 1,200 people go gasp, like, ah. And I said, well, why would a homosexual want to know whether I was excommunicated for adultery? And he said, you just called me a homosexual. No, I just did the same thing you did. You asked me if I was adultery. I asked you if you were a homosexual. The answer to your question is no. And he said, well, I'm not a homosexual. I said, I never said you were. I asked you, why would a homosexual care if I was excommunicated for adultery? And, it's a play on debate. And then he turned to the rest of the audience and he sat down. And he said, but I'm not a homosexual. But
so they were basically, they were trying to smear you, but by your account, they were trying to do to you what they've done to me, what they've done to so many, what they did to Fawn Brody, what they did to Simon Southerton, what they did to Michael Quinn. They couldn't attack a lot of the substance of what you were saying. And so they tried to smear your reputation. Now, I mentioned this previously for people who are joining us. You are now saying very clearly that you were not excommunicated for adultery, correct?
Absolutely. I was excommunicated by my own request. The actual copy of the document is on my website, and the actual original documents, my patriarchal blessing, my papers that I had, legal papers for the church, my excommunication, are on file at Utah State
University.
I was going to say Agricultural College, show my age. And at the Special Collections Library, number 210, the Ed Decker Library.
That's so awesome. Along with Leonard Arrington's papers, or Ed Decker's papers. Right. Ed, was adultery alleged in your divorce decree or in the divorce papers?
No.
No mention of divorce.
No, my wife. I think it says that he was seen with other women. Well, I worked with other women.
Okay. So you're flat out saying you did not commit adultery and you were not excommunicated for adultery.
No, but there was adultery in the issues of the divorce.
Right. I get what you're saying there.
I did not commit adultery.
Okay. So
I can't go any further than that.
So people were trying to smear you, is your account. And I don't know what's true, but what I know is that people who stand up against the church get smeared.
Yeah,
and it would
look at this, John. If it were true, if I was an axe murderer, and if I, as some people said, sexually abused my daughters, if I did all those things, if I actually killed people, shot down black people, I don't care what, if I did all that, it wouldn't change the doctrines of Mormonism 1 second to the left or to the right of what it really is.
Yeah.
And what it is Antichrist doctrine.
Right, right. Okay, so what was there ever a point where anyone from the church ever reached out to you, general authorities, leaders of the church? Did the church ever try and engage you with this?
Well, let me tell you a little quick story, 3 minutes. At one point in my recent life, now bear in mind that I've been a pastor for a number of years. I kind of put Mormonism off to the side. 20 years ago, I stopped traveling. I began doing my home and my ministry in a church and stuff, in my own church. And so I have a background that I've just gotten lost on that. Where were you taking me? And I just went the wrong door.
just that you were, I asked you if any general authorities had ever
Oh,
reached
yeah.
out to
Okay.
you or
There we
church
go.
leaders.
So about 10 years ago, I went to called up the bishop in what would be my ward in the little town up in Seattle area. I went to the bishop, called him and said, I'd like to meet with you. And I said, I want to talk about reconciliation. And so he met with me, and we sat down in his office in the little church in my town. And he said, tell me about reconciliation. I said, I want you to set aside the Book of Mormon. I want you to set aside Joseph Smith. What I want you to do is those are peripheral things to the core era in Mormonism. And we could actually come to agreement that Christ died on the cross for your sins and that you're set free and saved. And then you can do all the works you want because it says, you can show me your works, but you can show me your works, but I can show you my faith by my works. You're allowed to. You can do works because you are saved. We can come to a reconciliation. You could actually just bring that one piece of truth and correction into the church, and you'd be fine. And so he talked, and he said, "This needs to go higher than me." And he said, "We need to meet with the stake presidency in the Bellevue area." So we went. Another 3 weeks went by. We met, and it's really funny because when I finished with the bishop, he was leaving on a business trip, and I said, I grabbed his hands and I said, let's pray that God will make known to us the truth of what we've been talking about, and we'll pray for your business trip. And so I prayed. He was so accustomed to somebody taking his hands and holding his hands and praying. He was so uncomfortable about it, but he let me pray for him. So when I got to the stake president's office, there was 3 people in there, and I don't remember who they were. I think they were high council guys, and they had a real wide place, and they had chairs over on this side, and they had their chairs over here, and I had maybe 10 feet, 8 feet distance between me and them. So I picked up my chair and carried it over to and sat knee to knee with the stake president, and I went through the same thing. And they said, "Well, we're going to get back to you." When I was done, and again, I prayed the prayer that God would open up the God of the universe, the true God above all gods, would open up our hearts and our minds to reconcile together and come to an agreement. And he was saying, "Well, I want you to reconcile and commit, that you've been in error and that you've been in sin, and then we can go through a steps of repentance." And I said, "No, I'm not talking about that kind of reconciliation, because I'm ready to reconcile with you through Christ." And you claim
Yeah, that's not going to go
didn't.
anywhere.
It didn't work out well.
Yeah.
So they brought in a regional representative, and we went through the same process. And then I couldn't get him to respond to me after the meeting, and I kept after him. And finally, he sent me. He either said it on the phone or he sent me a message, and he said, "We can no longer keep these discussions. They're too disturbing to us, and the element of what is truth is difficult. You bring up these issues that make it difficult for us to discern the nature of truth."
Yeah.
And I was cut off.
So did the church ever try and sue you?
No, I sued them once.
For what?
I had a contract to show the movie The Godmakers in a Seattle market on primetime TV, and they got an injunction against me, and I sued them because I had to pay in advance a lot of money, and I showed up with my one attorney. They showed up with their 10 attorneys, and they dropped a stack of paper on the judge's table that was about a foot deep, and we came back and met, and he dismissed the case.
The judge did.
Yeah.
Somebody wrote that person who accused you of being an adulterer was your son. Did your son ever stand up in one of your public meetings and accuse you of adultery?
No, that was Richard Dick Bear. Dick Bear
Richard accused you?
had a ministry to Mormons. He's the guy I told you about that was excommunicated for adultery. Okay, the son that did that was from his first marriage, and she stayed in the church. He left the church and his marriage. He was divorced for adultery, and he was excommunicated for adultery. Later on, he got saved. He remarried. He had a ministry to the Mormon people. He was speaking, and one of his sons stood up in the middle of the church. And so someone who you partnered with to write the book. No, he had nothing. He was in the movie The God Makers. He's the guy sitting there with the attorneys with me. That's Dick Bear.
And is he an ex-Mormon?
He's passed away now. He was an ex-Mormon, twice excommunicated from the church. The first time for adultery, the second time for murder.
Were you aware that people retold that story but said it was you?
I mean, I've tried to correct that a million times, but people don't,
Yeah, because I just had someone write in and say that their parents said, don't trust Ed Decker because his own son came to one of his own meetings and accused him of adultery in the meeting, and that wasn't you at all.
No, in fact, two of my sons went on Mormon missions. Okay, my son Jeff fulfilled a 2-year mission in Chile, and my son John put in 6 or 8 months in Sicily, and he came home realizing he was teaching false, and people were correcting him. My son Jeff is very, very close to me, and he's never had his name removed from the records of the church, but he has never been inside of a Mormon church since.
So one of my listeners asked, did Thomas S. Monson really call you a son of perdition to your face? That's a rumor.
No, that was Mark E. Peterson.
And did you meet Mark Peterson?
I did not. He was speaking at a stake conference in Bellevue, Washington, at the Bellevue Stake.
Okay. So he said that about you when you weren't around.
Yeah, I wasn't there. He said, you have a son, talking about the evils attacking the church. And he said, you have a son of perdition living amongst you. and he lives in Issaquah. He comes from the Issaquah church.
It just is a total ironic. I lost my faith in Issaquah. I was in the Issaquah Third Ward, lived in Klahani up on the Issaquah Plateau.
Oh, really?
And that's where working for Microsoft, that's where I was called to teach seminary for the church, started studying church history, and I lost my faith in 2000.
I didn't know that. I had a farm on May Valley Road. I raised cows and chickens and.
That's funny. Okay, another question, another person writes, did you really say that it's okay to lie as long as it helps take the Mormon church down?
No, never said that.
Okay.
Some guy accused me of that a long time ago. I forget what the discussion was that I was having with him, and he said, "You're saying," I forget what the issue was. It was a true issue, and he said, "You're saying you say these heinous things about us. Do you think that the end justifies you doing that?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." Okay, I wasn't.
Oh, you're saying the tough things.
I was saying. He said heinous thing. You say these heinous things. It was a guy who was supposed to be the arbitrator between the Christian churches and the Mormon churches in our area. I know I could dig up his name if I spent an hour. But
no, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, let's talk. Okay, so one criticism I've heard about the cartoon and about the movie The God Makers is, instead of it being written and produced more sort of like a 60 Minutes, kind of like trying to be neutral, trying to be unbiased, instead of just trying to be as factual and as passionless and objective as possible and just laying out the facts. A lot of my listeners write, listen, the facts are disturbing enough. What you did in the God Makers, you sort of like, you put dramatic music in there. Well, let me just say what the argument is, and then you can respond. It's like you put ominous music in there. You did these dramatic reenactments. You you made, you had this scary music, and you basically poisoned the well by kind of overplaying your hand in terms of the drama and the sensationalism. You over sensationalized it, and in that way lost credibility. And some even wrote that they said that you kept them in the church longer than they would have stayed in, because they felt like the God Makers was kind of so over dramatic, over the top, over sensationalized, exaggerated, that they said, well, this is incredible. And so they doubled down and stayed Mormon for another 10 years. What do you make of that argument?
Well, first off, my whole ministry approach has always been that my ministry in my own church is that of an exhorter. I minister and I preach and I teach, and I dealt with Mormonism as a polemic person that I deal with. I'm not a gentle person. And as much as the Tanners put out volume after volume after volume of material that was very, very, there was no, well, there was, but there wasn't much judgment in the actual copies of the papers that they produced. They weren't having a mass breakthrough of tearing down the wall of darkness around Mormonism. And so when I went into that thing, I went into it, like I said, the one fellow, John L. Smith, said, you seem to have been called to set the fields afire all around within Mormonism. You're out there lighting, setting the fields on fire. There's a scripture in the Old Testament that talks about that. And I said, that's what God had called. I felt God wanted me to go boldly into it, boldly, face it down, go right into it and speak it out boldly. And if you read the chapter 6 of the book of Ephesians, said, I pray that I would speak boldly the things that I ought to speak. And that's the way I was. I still am somewhat that way, even though, I have a cane that I get around in. So, I'm not that kind. I was still bold. I'm not out there setting fields on fire. They were all burned out. Yes, we went. There was a Hollywood effort into those films that I did, and millions and millions and millions of people saw it. The very 6-minute cartoon about 10, 12 years ago, we did a calculation on the YouTube and the God tubes and the iTubes and all the other tubes on the internet, and had almost 20 million views of that 6-minute thing. Yes, I did go and set fields on fire, and I don't apologize for it. It broke down the wall, and tens of thousands of Mormons now love Jesus as their savior because of it.
So you feel like, for you, all the historians, all the meticulous researchers hadn't broken through the public consciousness. So by adding a dramatic flair and a dramatic element to it and a boldness, you were able to penetrate the public consciousness in ways that so many couldn't. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's a 1-hour movie, right? The God Makers?
58 minutes.
Okay, I just shared, there is a full version on YouTube, and I just shared it in our in the stream. For those who are following Mormon Stories podcast, this interview on Facebook, we'll make sure and include the full movie also in the show notes when we release the podcast.
Okay. The other thing that I want to say is, I think I sent you a PDF copy of my encyclopedic work on Mormonism called Decker's Complete Handbook on Mormonism.
Yeah.
And you have that. You have my permission. Do. You have my permission, because it deals with a huge number of the doctrines of Mormonism, missed a few, but it gives the Mormon position, where the Mormons get the position, what the Bible says about it, and the biblical doctrine to back up the Christian position in it. And it's about an 800-page book. They can have a copy of it if they go to you. Maybe if they drop you a little donation to help with your ministry there, they can have their own copy of it. It's theirs.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of ex-Mormons that are basically saying, I'm not going to listen to this interview because Ed lied all throughout. And I keep asking these people,
They lie.
even ex-Mormons, like, where did Ed lie? And I want people to tell me.
Yeah,
I'm going to read one criticism. So Peter writes, I was to some extent a victim of his inaccurate propaganda, although the book responding to him, The Truth About the God Makers, was a godsend when I was defending the church from his and others' inaccurate propaganda before the internet arrived with a friend at uni who ended up joining the church. So in a weird way, there was a silver lining. I read his biography years ago and it did not feel honest. He's saying it didn't feel honest. He represented himself as far too naive to be realistic, if I remember correctly. I too would like to know why he lied so much in his propaganda when you don't need to. This is going to be a fascinating interview, John, but you need to do some prep with a specific list of things he obviously lied about. And if it is going to have integrity, as you have already seen in this thread, that even post-Mormons and skeptics are not impressed by him because of that. The Tanners distance themselves from him, I believe, so it would be interesting to ask about those tensions and relationships among the superstar anti-Mormons. Good luck. Okay, so Peter's saying, and we talked about this previously, did the Tanners ever say, Ed, these are 3 things you got wrong?
Yes.
What were the things that they said you got wrong?
That Lucifer was the god of the Mormon temple.
Okay, and I actually agree with the Tanners on that. But the thing I would want to say back to Peter is, even if Ed said that, that doesn't obviate that doesn't eliminate the 95% of the book and the movie that he got right.
No,
So,
but
and also I would say that's Ed's, Ed, that was your opinion. I would say that's not, that's an interpretation on your part.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
And I'm not shy about it. It's on my website. Go read it.
Yeah, and that's the Sure Sign of the Nail essay that you keep referring us to.
Sure Sign of the Nail. If you've been to the temple, you understand the title. And what did I lie about here? I came up out of a rough life, poor kid, worked my way in life. I don't have a college degree. I have a high school diploma. As my last lambskin, or whatever you want to call it, that's the last thing I got. And people say, well, you're not qualified. Show me where I'm not qualified. I've spent 40 years. I was a member of Mensa when I was a young man, until I thought how silly it was for very intelligent people to sit around and talk about how intelligent they were. I figure my IQ now is probably half of what it was when I was in that age. But the point of it is, even with half of what I used to have, I can still know what's truth and what's right. I don't lie.
Yeah.
You may not like what I say. I don't lie.
There's going to be a lot of people that say, John, you should have come ready with all the inaccuracies. The reason why I didn't come with a big list of inaccuracies is I've freaking seen the movie. And I know that you could nitpick on details or sensationalistic parts. And I asked you about the sensationalism, and you did that on purpose. It'd be hard for anyone to argue with the effectiveness in terms of, number one, the public consciousness, the publicity that you successfully achieved, along with the meaningful change that came about after. And so for me, people that are going to nitpick the Godmakers 1 because of this or that historical thing or this or that embellishment, what I'm going to put back on them is, what are you going to say about 95% of the accurate stuff that he did convey that really was factual, even if sensationalized? And 2, how are you going to argue with the impact? So that's my pushback.
There was an article in the Denver Post years back, and they were talking about, this is when the Godmakers was all over the place, and I was in Denver at one of the theological schools there and showing it, and there was some comment, and the Denver Post asked a leader in the Mormon Church from Salt Lake City, one of the general authorities, what do you have to say about this? He said, we have had of people opposing the church in the past. We have people opposing the church today. He said, but these guys, meaning the Godmaker guys, know how to use the media. And it was a big thing because that's where we would go in, and that's where it would be. One of the complaints that everybody has had about the book, about the Mormon, the movie, The Godmakers, has been that we have taken like a Mormon mission president, and we've named this guy named Grant, and we keep cutting. We've pasted together an hour interview into a 3-minute interview to make it say what we wanted to say. But the problem that we had with this guy Grant was that we'd ask him a question and he'd give a 20-second response and then slip over off it to some other else. And we had to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Again, I wasn't doing this. The filmmakers were doing it, using my questions and stuff. And it took forever to get the whole statement out of the guy. So yes, it was cut and paste, but if you ever went back to the actual, and we have available the actual footage of the interview, you'd see that we did not manipulate it one bit. He tried to manipulate it.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. Were you aware, several people have told me this, that a lot of Mormons associated your last name with Black and Decker, and growing up in the 80s and 90s, there were Mormons who were told you can't buy from Black and Decker because that's supporting Ed Decker and
Oh God, I wish I belonged to that family.
Were you aware that there were lots of Mormons that wouldn't buy Black and Decker because of you?
No. I have a funny story about that, but I'll skip it. It's not germane to the subject.
Mark writes, the Godmakers was shown on Czech national television during my mission, and it caused all sorts of fallout. Meanwhile, I had friends serving in Seattle who apparently ran into him, and he invited them to his rumpus room for pool and root beer. Amazing but true. Does that sound possible that you would have invited some missionaries for pool and root beer?
I had missionaries at my home all the time. I never had a basement, okay, and I never had a pool table. But I had missionaries. It was like every missionary team in that era would come up and knock on my door and have a picture taken with me. We'd invite them in and we'd have some milk or cookies or something, and we'd sit there and just love on them. And I had all my career that I was in areas where the Mormon missionaries came through. I live in a senior development, and there's a gate there. The guys that can't get in there, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons don't come in here. So I don't get them today. But I have literally, over the years, had hundreds of missionaries that we loved on, fed, and we didn't get into the arguments of the doctrine. These are young kids away from their family. They want to sit down and have a meal without having to, be on best behavior because they're at a Mormon's house or the bishop's house. No, they'd come over. I was the evil one, but I wasn't evil, and they knew I wasn't evil. And my wife loved on them, and we have always had a wonderful. One time we owned a house that belonged to somebody in the ministry, and we were trying to get it ready to sell it, and I had to use a big high pressure spray thing, and I couldn't get it out of the station wagon, and I just said, Lord God, I need some help. Who comes walking around the wall, around the hedges, but a couple of Mormon missionaries? And just as I was praying, and they said, "Oh, hi, could you?" I just had some friendly conversation with them. I said, "Could you help me get this out?" They not only got it out, but they wanted to run the spray. I mean, they were just nice kids, I mean, I've never, ever, that I can recall, trashed a Mormon missionary. I mean, I laid it down a time or two. If I was invited to a house where they're about ready to baptize some poor person, and they would get very upset with me. But I never would trash a young man. I mean, these guys are giving up 2 years of their lives. My goodness.
Yeah. Okay. A couple other comments from listeners. And these are some criticisms. And then I want to get to Godmakers 2 and your allegations against Gordon B. Hinckley, sexual allegations. But before we jump to that, Jody writes, Mr. Decker's opinion is presented as fact. We should always strive for the truth. Defending his being 95% accurate is intellectually dishonest. So she's telling me this. He made up those things about satanic temple ceremonies to get more views of his video. So what would your response be to Jody, who's saying you made up that garbage about Satan temple ceremonies to get more views of your movie?
I would say either she's a liar or she's never been to the temple and she's being very, very naive.
Okay. So you're saying you didn't make up stuff about Satan in the temple to get more views?
I never used the word Satan.
Or Lucifer, whatever.
Yeah, I use, Lucifer is the word that they use.
Right.
So why would I come up with a different word for him?
Okay, so Lucifer, she's basically saying you came up with the Lucifer stuff in the temple to get more views of your movie and your book.
No, I got more reviews of the movie and the book because of the temple and Lucifer in the temple.
Lisa writes, I'm grateful for Ed and the fact that he put these ideas and teachings out there. As offensive as it was to me at first, it helped me discover the fact that there was a lot I didn't know and got the ball rolling in researching the foundations of the church I was brought up in. I thank people who aren't afraid to put the facts out there that bring about conversations and open communication about teachings and facts that are true but not communicated or taught today. So that's a thank you from Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
I'm just going to say that I've seen them do this to Jeremy Runnels. I've seen them do this to Kate Kelly. I've seen them do this to me, to anyone who basically stands up and tells the truth about the church or speaks boldly and inconveniently about the church. There's always the argument that you didn't have the right tone. You got a fact wrong here or there. You were dishonest. You had bad intentions. You were an adulterer. And I'm just going to push back on everybody who tells me I jumped the shark doing this interview. I shouldn't have interviewed you. You were deceptive. I think way too many, even ex-Mormons, have fallen prey to the discrediting of people because they speak boldness against the church. And I'm not going to say you were always accurate or that you didn't bring your own interpretations or that you didn't sensationalize. All that's true. But anyone who again, I'm repeating myself now, anybody who dismisses you summarily because you brought drama to things or got some facts wrong or interpreted things wrong, at least for Godmakers 1, I reject that because you got way more right than you got wrong. But more importantly, you were way more effective at bringing public awareness and it actually leading to direct change about the church than anyone else I'd love to hear you guys name in the 80s and 90s. That's just my editorial opinion.
Thank you.